Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. Today is Wednesday, December 9th, 2020, the year that will never end. And today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators this past week. I want to give a special shout out to those that are watching live here on Facebook, those that are watching on repeat on the Facebook page for SMIE Consulting, as well as our YouTube channel. And for those that make this roundup part of your podcast listening each week, thank you especially to you for making a special effort to include SMIE Consulting as part of your weekly international edification. So we hope today's conversation will be useful to you as you go about your work in international education. Wanted to start first with, for those that are new to the roundup, how we come about with, and I've been asked this a couple times, how we come about with the three questions we ask each week. For those that are already subscribed to our newsletter, all the SMIE News Fit to Share weekly e-newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings, we break that down into two different areas of news, social media news and international ed news, and often where those two areas overlap, because that's what our business is. And what we do is we look for themes in some of the news articles that we're seeing each week that ask and answer the kinds of questions that really help drive us forward as an industry in international education and specifically international student recruitment here in the United States, as we look at what we're doing internally in the U.S., but also how the rest of the world is viewing the topics of the day or the issues of the day that affect what we do. And that's the important thing. I think any conversation I have with international educators these days in the U.S. starts and finishes with the idea of this global competition we are in for international students who have many choices around the world, not just your domestic rivals that they might choose to attend, but other destination countries that are attractive to them because of various policies that governments have or institutions have. So we're going to look at all of that in all of our conversations, but we'll start today specifically with one that has been an example of how the last 4 years has gone for international education in the U.S., where the judicial system has often come to the rescue for international education and immigration policy decisions that would be favorable to the United States as a destination for international students. So the first question is, how has the judicial system viewed Trump's immigration plans? And this is more of a historical look, but specifically in the last week, there's been a series of judicial decisions that have certainly gone our way in terms of international education and a pro-immigration stance that have certainly counterbalanced the rhetoric in terms of the and impact in actual implementation of legal precedents, have reversed a lot of what the current administration, the outgoing administration's plans have been since day one. And day one started with a bang in January of 2017 when the first travel ban was implemented. And for even that travel ban, which is perhaps the only real significant immigration regulation change that the administration put in place, had to go through three different versions before one passed Supreme Court muster. So even in that, still hurts for a lot of international educators, and remains a very dark time, beginning of a dark time in our field here in the U.S. But even that had been watered down to be very much more specific and targeted in its implementation. So, but the three rulings that we're talking about this week had to do with H-1B, OPT, and DACA. And I'll be posting links to those three that all came down in favor of a more expansive view of those three areas. For those that aren't familiar, and I post the links to the news stories that are helping to answer these questions in the comments section on the Facebook page. So if you're looking for those to help for your edification, please go to our Facebook page for SMIE Consulting LLC. That's where you'll find it, and you'll get those links there to help you go a little deeper into the individual articles. The first up was a judge in San Francisco, federal judge in San Francisco, set aside two Trump administration policies that required employers to pay foreign workers on H-1B significantly higher wages, as well as narrowing the eligibility for the program H-1B that is highly valued by U.S. tech firms and other employers. So this is obviously at the end of the international student life cycle after their OPT is complete. That's a number of international students, particularly those from India, tend to migrate towards H-1B jobs that have to extend their time in here in the United States and potentially lead to green cards and permanent residency and such. So this policy, the decision or the judge's decision, set aside the policy changes that the Trump administration was trying to implement. That was really seen as a move to tighten the eligibility for H-1B and to price out most of the entry-level international students and overseas potential employees that companies would want to bring in because the wages would be too high for most of the companies to justify the expense. So this has been seen largely in the article as quotes it. The director of immigration policy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce called it breathing a huge sigh of relief as a result of this ruling. So that's certainly a win for those of us in international education who, when we talk about outcomes for our international students, this is something that I think we only do and have anecdotal evidence of. It's certainly a challenge when we try and tell our story as a successful story as institutions of how well our students do after they leave us in terms of the alumni success stories, so to speak. But you need to you can tell those stories in context and should be able to tell those stories in context of what is possible for international students here in the United States after they're finished with their degree. And certainly H-1B is an important piece of that puzzle. The other important decision that came down that's directly impacting international students is the lawsuit that was thrown out. This was brought by the Washington Alliance of Technology Workers. Actually back in 2017 it was brought to have OPT declared illegal and thrown and basically dismantle the program. That this was seen as a huge threat to employers that maybe eventually would hire OPT students after they graduate, kind of getting that fresh talent right after they finish their degrees from either bachelor's and or master's doctoral programs that allow from anywhere to 1 to 3 years of work experience after graduation. And that is protecting that program was seen as the area of international education that there were kind of always hints that there's something big coming, that the administration wants to severely restrict or take away parts of OPT, and that was kind of what we always were hoping. Certainly, if Trump had been elected for a second term, we most likely would have seen some significant action in this arena to take on OPT. But thankfully, this judge's decision, by throwing out the lawsuit, which probably will be appealed, but the likelihood of it being taken up by the Supreme Court or other courts below them is fairly low. So that is encouraging, certainly for international educators here in the U.S. to see the courts coming to our rescue, frankly, and really standing up for what's right in our field in international education. And that's encouraging and certainly always gave me some pause for not getting too overly excited by obviously the very real damage done due to the rhetoric of this administration related to international education. And in the end, it came good in terms of our system came good in terms of restricting preventing a lot of these restrictive policies from going into place. So certainly kudos to the judges involved in these cases and standing up for really what's right in this country for what we stand for, and developing the nation as we have it today wouldn't be possible with the immigrants that have come to our country, both as students, both as direct entrepreneurs from overseas that have become founders of major companies in this country that are global brands. And this is something we can never want to erase in our history as a country, and on how we are based. I'm a product of the immigration system that has been in place for years, that allowed my father to come to the United States when I was only 5, as an intra-company transfer, to allow him to work in the United States, and eventually, after a number of years, apply for permanent residency, and we all have become citizens as a result of that immigration system that allowed us to come. And that was under threat. Even people like myself this summer, with the restrictions put in place, the travel restrictions put in place for H1s and Ls and other visa statuses that were not going to be allowed in until the new year. That would have prevented my family from coming to the United States back in 1974 if that kind of a policy were in place back then. So these judicial rulings certainly are seen and heralded as successes. But should this have to happen in this day and age in our country's history, that that judges have had to defend basically what the United States is all about? No, and Karen Fisher made this point in her weekly newsletter this week as well, that we shouldn't have to rely on the courts to prevent the implementation of policy that would be severely restrictive to what we do. It should be a given. International education has always been seen as a white hat issue, as they say in Washington, D.C. Political circles, that it was has always been a bipartisan issue. And I think largely still is. It's for many folks on the Hill, it's they don't want to put their head above the parapet when the administration keeps lobbing bombs over to blow up parts of our system that are bedrock to what we do and to the principles that this nation is founded on. So kudos to the judges that were involved, and also the DACA ruling, that's the one that actually just came down, that is seen as most significant, that a judge ordered that DACA be re-implemented back to the Obama administration's initial extensions that were granted. So there'll be more on these judicial rulings, I'm sure, and a lot of the things that we were predicting the Biden administration would, after it takes office in January, would be addressing as far as international ed concerns are being taken care of now. And I think the OPT, the H-1B, I covered all of those in a recent presentation I gave during International Ed Week that I'll share the link to shortly. But a lot of the things that we were hoping the new administration would address, the judicial system is starting to help get at least some of those off the plate of the new administration, not having to expand or extend the bandwidth that's necessary to make those happen. So encouraging to see that. There are obviously still some issues involved with OPT, with H-1B, that hopefully a new administration will solidify and codify what's important in those areas and make it a more streamlined process, perhaps. Dual intent student visas, I think, would be an important step in that direction. That might be coming down the pike. We don't know any of the details yet, but certainly a lot more that can happen, and we'll certainly cover those decisions as they get made. Second question, an important question in November with all the releases of data that we got during International Education Week. Now a lot of folks have had time to process that all from the various sources. Now that we're in December, I want to ask the question, does data truly inform solutions in international student recruitment, particularly in the United States here? And to that end, my latest article for IDP Connect addresses the kind of overload. You can easily get overwhelmed by all the different data sources that are out there. But the focus is not only just with this article, posting the link to in the Facebook page. The concept of the article is data overload, focus on what matters most moving forward with international student recruitment. So really, with the article, I talk about the different sources that and high-level data trends that we saw through Open Doors, through the International Students in U.S. High School report, through NAFSA's International Student Economic Value Tool, the IIE Fall Snapshots Survey, and then the CVIS by the Numbers report that's focused on September 2020 data that was just released also during IEW. So all of that data that came out, a lot of it was negative. There's hard to find the positives in there, and I cover a lot of that in the article. But what you really see is whenever you kind of get data like that that clearly paints a very negative picture of the current situation. We all know what's happened in the last year. We went from kind of tooling along, hoping to get to the elections in last month. In January, we're thinking, okay, we've only got a maximum of a year more of this to deal with, but then the pandemic hit and threw everybody's plans up in the air. Students, institutions, staff at international ed offices that were on the road, that were no longer going to be traveling, still aren't traveling, may not be traveling till maybe 2022, late 2021, it may be. You're seeing a lot of turmoil in our field, and not just the world, but our field as well. That vaccines are around the corner, that they're starting to be given in the UK this week, that they may soon be, doses are being readied for distribution here in the United States in the next week or two. But there's 330 million people in the U.S., and it's going to take quite a while for it to get to most of us doing what we do, unless we're high-risk categories, to allow us to resume normal life. And students are probably down that list as well in terms of their ability to get the vaccines, whatever it might be. So the realities of what we're dealing with the impact on our industry, the way we do what we do, taking all that into consideration, to the numbers that we had this fall, certainly were not great. The data certainly suggests that this is the bottoming out, if you will, of what's happened as a result of Trump and the pandemic. The combination of the two really just sunk most of our international ed plans for 2020. And what I think what's needed now is certainly the kind of perspective I was talking about at the top of the Roundup this week. And that is looking at not just what's happening in the United States, because what had happened and the way it worked out for for a lot of institutions in the United States. We dealt with this summer the potential threat that returning students would not be able to study in the U.S. if they were going to be online or hybrid, meaning more than one class online during the fall term. That was a threat. That threat got addressed and reversed, that again through the courts, that allowed returning students to study this fall in either hybrid or fully online modes from their home country or within the United States, that they could actually physically come back and not lose status. That's a huge deal. What we saw, and this is what I always talk about, there was a huge uproar about that. Even the decision to not extend that same benefit for new students that were just starting their programs to be able to study fully online or in a hybrid program. That the actual implementation of our policy was still criticized for new students from a lot in international ed circles. But when you look at the global context, what we did in the U.S. was probably one of the more liberal policies globally when it came to student enrollment in this fall term. You saw in Australia, you saw in New Zealand closing borders in February, in Australia in March, China in February. In Canada, unless you had a visa issued before March, middle of March, you weren't able to enter Canada for study in the early part of the pandemic. And for Canada, what they did was actually implement something very similar to what our government was proposing in July, in beginning of July, when that DHS ruling came down to prohibit returning students from studying hybrid or online. What Canada has done is, unless your institution was physically requiring you to be on campus, you weren't allowed into Canada at all. So that was a much more restrictive policy. So we're certainly on the more liberal scale in terms of what our entry policies were this fall. But you see, the one country that did have all their pieces together, it was the UK. They have come out this fall, at least in terms of numbers, the actual experience for students on campus largely seen as positive, or 81% decided in the UK, or that's responded to an IDP Connect survey, said that they were happy with their experiences in the UK this fall. Aside from the US, the UK had probably the most liberal policies for entry, because they had all their programs were pretty much fully hybrid, with all but a few classes a few discussion sections those were about the only ones in person, and that has a lot to do with their education system that is much more segmented to academic disciplines, where you could have your incoming group of freshmen that were, or freshers as they like to say in the UK, that were in a specific discipline. They had small groups that met together in their discipline. They don't have large gen ed courses that we do in the US for undergraduate education. So they were able to segment out a lot better in bubbles for their majority of their smaller discussion sections had all their lectures online. That system has seemed to work. Most all the institutions had committed to going that way before the year began. And what the major difference between the UK and the US that allowed them to have success this fall that we did not, in terms of enrolling numbers, that were already going to be probably at best level with the previous year, but probably a little bit lower in terms of where the expectations were going with new students in particular. You see what we suffered from in the United States is, even to this month, 70% of our embassies and consulates are still closed for student visa services. Unless it's an emergency appointment in 3 of the 6 embassies and consulates in India or China, you cannot get a visa appointment unless it's within 15 days of the start date on your I-20. So giving you very little time, and that's considered an emergency appointment. So, and that's only at half of the embassies and consulates in our 2 major destination countries. And many of those were not open in August and early September, when the majority of students were going to be going for visas anyway. So that's why you saw so few, 43% reduction in new student enrollments from the snapshot survey that IIE and partner organizations took this fall. To only be down 43% is just a miracle, frankly. With our 2 largest countries basically closed for new international students to get visas to come. And that data is backed up, not just by what I'm suggesting here, but by some of the Department of State sites that track this. They have the visa wait times list. That's where my colleague Jason Hall has tracked that data. Every week they've been updating that with the number of consulates closed. You also see at the end of the fiscal year, the reports on the visas issued in the previous year, which would include the spring and summer times when most students will be going for their visas. In our 2 largest markets, China, student visas issued between April and September, down 99%. Only 808 student visas were issued between April and September, down from 90,000 from the previous year. In India, over the entire fiscal year, so going back to October 1st, 2019 through end of September 2020, 64% drop in F1 visas in fiscal year 20. So those 2 destination countries having that significant of a drop in student visas issued, that's why we have so few new students here in the United States this fall. And that's the perspective I'm talking about here. Australia has been closed since March. New Zealand's been closed since February. China's been closed since February. That's a top 3 actually student destination country as well. So all of these countries, and Canada, we talked about their restrictions. Aside from the UK, the US has come out probably better than most major destinations around the world in terms of ability to enroll new students this fall. In context, in that global perspective that I'm talking about needing, that is where I think you see a lot of the differences in how we can view moving forward what what a new normal will be, and those are probably, other than new normal, pivoting our tack, or changing tack, or pivoting to a new way of doing things, are the most overused phrases in our business recently. But whatever this new normal is, when we get back to it, when visas are, consulates and embassies are open and visas are being regularly issued again, we'll be in a much different situation come next fall. And that's something that I think we can all move towards. There's been talk of pent-up demand, much like there is with everybody who's gotten stir-crazy during the pandemic with lockdowns, wanting to eventually schedule vacations next summer if that happens, once we're all vaccinated, if that's the case. That is, there's going to be pent-up demand for everybody to get out and experience life again outside our homes. There's also going to be that pent-up demand for students to begin again their goal of studying on campus somewhere outside their home country. And that is really what drives, and the IDP data that we're talking about, and I mentioned in the article, certainly reflects that what students want now. And these the IDP data looks at offer holders in the top from major source countries going to major destination markets, and the numbers of students that are willing to go through a quarantine rather than defer, so that they can have face-to-face education, it has grown dramatically from June to October. So there is still the time and countries that can offer the in-person experience, even though the majority might be hybrid of their courses and online. The living on campus, the living in a community with other students, that still drives student interest in the greater scheme of things. Are there going to be adjustments to how we do things moving forward in terms of the kinds of degrees we're offering, how they're offered? I think there will be and should be. It's just going to be a natural evolution of what's happening. The question will be is whether our immigration policies will keep up with the changes that are going to be needed to allow that to happen. So we'll look at what's possible in the coming months as to what the data certainly shows us is that, yes, the historical data certainly reflects this year is awful. And it's going to go down in history as probably one of the worst intakes in U.S. International enrollment cycles ever. But in context, it's a lot better than our competition in terms of volume, in terms of percentages, and the reasons for our lower numbers are self-inflicted, frankly, by consulates and embassies not being able to reopen in time to allow students to interview and get their visas. And that's the visa interview piece is the most critical element in that. The reason why the UK's visa services have been so successful is that doesn't always require an interview, is that it can be done through the mail in many locations, or have locations that are not bound by local government regulations that can open commercial businesses that can open that run visa services for the UK. So that's where they have had a much greater competitive advantage this year. So I'm sharing also, in addition to the article, a link to my International Education Week presentation, Fighting the Good Fight, that prepare for the International Ed Challenges of the next 4 years that I did for Millersville University in Pennsylvania. It's a link to the presentation I did there. The last, and I'll cover more about that next week, but the last story or question I have is how should universities change their degree offerings in wake of COVID-19? And this question is answered through a couple different ways. One, what we were just talking about in how degrees are delivered in the way they have been delivered during the pandemic, with hybrid being high flex, all the variations on the theme there of what hybrid learning looks like. We've also just heard, and we'll cover next week, the continuation of the fall policy and procedures relating to current students' registrations, that they can be hybrid and or online fully in the spring term as well, in terms of ISSS offices' ability to register their students for the spring. So that's good news. We'll cover more of that later. But what you look at moving forward is how U.S. opportunities can benefit from the pandemic in terms of decision making from a student perspective post-pandemic, what they're going to be looking for. They want greater flexibility in their degrees. There'll be a variety of different countries that students might be looking for, and how does the U.S. address questions of affordability with our tuition fees that are based on in-person education are significantly higher than what an online education would be worth, perhaps, and what the implications of hybrid means, and how we partner together with universities overseas. That might be, as some U.S. institutions did this fall, where they had their new cohorts from China attend their first semester and year of study at a partner institution, or some variation of that overseas model. What does that look like moving forward as a part or piece of the 4-year degree experience for undergraduates? So there's changes on that front. There's an article from University World News by Adrian Mutton, founder and CEO of CENM-S4, that's been very active in India. A number of U.S. institutions partner with them there. The final article is an example of what some countries, like Australia, they're adjusting to a reality this in our spring, their fall in February, March, that they're still not going to have open borders. That there is a test group that just landed 63 students in the Northern Territories this month, but they are focusing on a period between the rest of 2021 to focus on distance learning and transnational education. Two concepts that we get domestically in the United States, distance learning, but not necessarily transnational. There are very few branch campuses and other programs that are fully offered online. But using versions of that transnational education to help bridge the gap or create models that will require first year overseas or through a pathway provider overseas before they can come in. So Australia has been forced down this path of becoming more flexible in how they look at their degree offerings because of the pandemic, and I think the U.S. needs to look that way as well. And the world is changing. It's getting smaller, and it's getting easier to do what students typically need to do from anywhere in the world. There's still going to be that need for that on-campus piece, but it's going to be less important, I think, in the months and years moving forward as a component of the full experience, that it all be done online or in person. So that's what we have for you this week on the Roundup. Looking forward to continuing the conversation with you in the weeks and months to come. But for now, that's all we got, and we look forward to chatting with you in the weeks and months to come. Have a great day.